Hello everyone, this is Piero San Giorgio. Today I'm going in Geneva. We're going to interview a great guy, Richard Grannon. Richard Grannon, hello.
Hello.
Welcome to Geneva.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Comment va ton français?
Oh, très bien. Nous pouvons parler en français, he said very haltingly. It's not as good as my Spanish.
Well, today we're going to do this interview in English, but maybe next time in French for my audience.
Maybe.
Now, my audience probably doesn't know who you are, what you do. Can you tell us a little bit what's your background and what is it that you do? You have a huge following, huge channel on internet. Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit about you.
My background is I'm a psychology graduate, and I was working in the nightclub security industry for about 10 years, I think, from the moment I graduated. And during that time, I started teaching self-defense and martial arts, which was a major passion for me, but also the psychological elements of it. So that's where I had I stood out in that particular grouping, in that niche, was the psychology side, the emotional elements of martial arts and self-defense training in particular. That then developed into me running psychology seminars and coaching people on where they were up to emotionally, and that then developed into the current project, which is called Spartan Life Coach, which was originally to help men who were, martial artists, soldiers, bodyguards, whatever, who were struggling to assert themselves. That was the main idea behind it. Yeah.
So what do, you put people on a couch and you talk to them, or you do it online, or you do conferences? What's your way to do it?
I should put people on the couch. I should do it the Freudian way and stick them on a couch. Originally when I started out coaching people, I would be doing it through seminars, group sessions. I'd do it on Skype, as you say. Sometimes I'd see them in my office. Now all I do is seminars and courses. So I'll amass the questions that I'm getting, the concerns that I'm getting from people who follow my work, and then I'll try and come up with practical solutions to help deal with anxiety, depression, or whatever it is people are struggling with.
What are the usual... When we first met, you mentioned an interesting statistic on how people suffering from trauma created in youth has incredibly increased. Mm-hmm. And this is counterintuitive to a world that is much more comfortable and wealthy than it used to be. What trends do you see in why people get trauma?
Well, one of the worst statistics that I looked at for mental health issues when it affects young people was from the United Kingdom, and it was for kids between the age of 10 and 14 who were being admitted to accident and emergency for body dysmorphia issues like anorexia and bulimia, and it had quintupled. It had gone up by 500% since 2010 to now, which is a huge increase. So though things are more comfortable, they're more affluent, nobody is in the first world but is particularly starving, there are other factors there that are traumatizing people. I think it's a misunderstanding of human needs. I think there's really, really a dramatic drift away from what people really want versus what we think people really want and how we act that we really want. And so, a lot of kids are being really damaged by that, because whilst material needs are being met, emotional and psychological needs are not. And these emotional psychological needs are not anything, nobody needs a degree in psychology to offer them. They need time, they need attention, they need people to hang around with them and tell them everything's going to be okay. And they're not getting that. Where they're not getting it, they're drifting online, drifting into the wild world of the internet, where they're bombarded with images that when they're so young, they're so impressionable, these images can really do a lot of damage to them. The
effect of that trauma can carry on for a long time in life, mm-hmm. and create a lot of damage, personal addictions, I guess, work inability to work, or bond relationships, or perhaps even remember you were saying eventually fall into relationships that keep being abusive.
Yes, yeah. So the typical way that that's described is if you've got if you didn't get what you needed from either of your parents and you weren't able to attach with them in a healthy way, there'll be a bit of damage to the way in which you can form love with other people. And you'll tend to repeat the pattern again and again and again, trying to heal the original experience, the original painful experience. So a lot of the work that I focus on now is in emotionally abusive, narcissistically abusive relationships. And that's men and women that I'm working with. People are realizing that they've been in relationships where they've been under attack for sometimes years on end, and that has deleterious effects on the mind, on the emotions, and even the hormones. And that creates a long-term traumatic response that's called complex PTSD. Everybody watching this knows what PTSD is. Complex PTSD is multi-contextual. So with PTSD, you will usually remember a single event or singular events, and then you'll relive the event again and again, and the emotions come with that. In complex PTSD, you don't remember the event, you only relive the emotions again and again. So if it was, let's say, sexual abuse in childhood, and there's an intense feeling of shame, you don't flash back to the root event of the sexual assault. You just emotionally flash back to the shame over and over again. So yeah, that's a lot of where my work is focused on right now, is helping people to resolve that. Because if they don't, they keep getting back into abusive relationships. The unconscious is still trying to solve the puzzle of finding loving attachment.
Now, psychology, or at least the study of psychology and psychotherapy, is a fairly recent science, if we can call it science. There's been many trends, chapters, from behaviorism to many exposure therapy, whatever. What, in your experience, works best or works the least, or how do you adapt any of those kind of therapies, or especially for those trauma victims, if you wish?
There isn't really one school that I adhere to. As I said, my background's in martial arts, and I was a big fan of Bruce Lee, like a lot of martial arts people are. So I use the Jeet Kune Do approach, which is I just took from different styles and put it together. What did he say? Absorb what is useful and then just dismiss the rest. So I will use, there's elements of Zen in psychotherapy, there's elements of Freud, there's elements of Jung, there's CBT, there's from all over. If I can see something that's useful and it's going to work, I'll use it. I don't really do anything that's particularly odd. I'm treated within the community like I'm trailblazing and like I'm some fringe guy, but what I do, as far as counselling goes, I have a lot of psychotherapists and counsellors who follow me, because that's actually the solutions when I stop telling long stories about Star Wars and fighting people and actually get down to the solutions. It's very mainstream. I think the only difference is the way that I present it. So I'm more effective at convincing people of the ideas that counselling has been putting forward for a long time. So it's an old trope in a film for a counsellor to say to a client, if you're watching a movie, they will just repeat the phrase, "How does that make you feel? How does that make you feel?" They didn't, and everybody knows that, but what's not explained as is when you are traumatized, you lose contact with your emotions. And when you lose contact with your emotions, you become emotionally illiterate, and the whole system starts to freeze up. Anxiety gets worse, depression gets worse. It can even affect sexual performance. And so getting people back in touch with their feelings is actually hugely important. It'll make you smarter. For the survivalist guys, emotional literacy, I think, directly relates to intuition and your sense of when you are in danger. The people who are going to survive across multiple contexts, I think, will need every element of the human system in full operation. All of the senses aware and alert, and part of that is emotional literacy. The more traumatized you get and the more your emotional literacy freezes, the more difficult that becomes. You know, when people make really bad decisions.
When? Can you read that?
Yeah, when people make really, really bad decisions.
Yeah.
We have cases of people being assaulted, and then afterwards, post-interview, we'll say, "I knew something was wrong. I knew this was a bad guy." You go, why did you go with him then? Why didn't you do something about it? That's emotional illiteracy. That's people who've trained to break away from their instincts, their intuitions, and their emotions.
Could culture get us to dismiss these cues of danger?
100%. It absolutely is. The cultural indoctrination now is to forego instinct, to forego your natural animal drives, to forego your emotional literacy, to forego any sense of intuition. Culture wants to bring you out of the self, and that's why we're all in such a mess psychologically, is because we're being pulled inside out. We're not allowed to go into the self because there's no profit in people going into themselves. It's extreme. If we all become a bunch of happy hippies out in the woods, you know, having sex, raising our own food as you're training people to do, and, you know, being out in nature and just feeling like this is amazing. Well, why do you need to buy the next Tesla? Why do you need to buy expensive shoes? You're satisfied. That's terrible for me as your government. I hate that. So I have to destroy it. I have to keep you. In sales psychology, we know the more agitated people are, the more they spend. So sales copy and advertising is actually there to agitate, to aggravate, to make people anxious, angry, fearful, or jealous. It pokes all of the negative emotions. We're surrounded by this negative advertising all the time. And it basically turns everybody extremely agitated and very externally focused. It's good to be externally focused. We need it, but it's yin and yang. We need both. We also need to be yin, and we need to be internally focused as well, because that's where the instinct, the intuition comes from, and also the capacity for love and intimacy. It's not going to be great to survive in a world where if there's no love, it's going to be pointless.
I agree. So people who you trained with special forces, with police, with military people. This is usually where we traditionally picture people with PTSD potentially. And of course, we add to these people who have suffered extreme violent, either childhoods or events throughout their life.
I'm finding that highly traumatic.
So no, that's fine. And therefore, I just speak louder in these cases. And with my authority, noises stops. And therefore, but also people who got, for example, rape or even while adults. And what is your experience with treating people with post-traumatic stress disorder? And perhaps, I think my audience may not know exactly what PTSD is. Can you tell us a bit about it and how you treat it?
Yeah, sure. The simplest way of saying it is like something really bad happens that overwhelms you to the point where you can't effectively respond. And it's like the body gets switched on to a state of emergency, danger, and then doesn't switch off. So if it happened to you once, your body will just go, this could happen at any moment, and now we need to remain agitated, alert and aware, trying to make sure that that never happens again. So it's like an ineffectual post hoc response to something that's already happened. For PTSD to be PTSD, there's always going to be an element of helplessness. If one were, say, you use the example of rape, sexual assault, if you were sexually assaulted, say you ended up in prison and you were sexually assaulted, but you fought, and even if the aggressor's intentions were semi-successful, but you had fought to the best of your ability and had a moderate degree of, we won't call it success under such awful circumstances, but you had some agency in that, we know that your PTSD would be less. Because PTSD is really it's focused on a past event, but it's fear of the future. It's fear of a new fear, of something else awful happening. If it's not really the event itself, it's how you dealt with it in that moment. It's one of the worst elements of PTSD is when you see yourself responding in a way that you didn't think. So you respond, we go through the same experience. You're attacked, it's violent and it's horrible, but you respond by fighting and you survive it and you go, okay, well that was awful, but I did this and I did this and I did this. I get attacked and I freeze, and then I find myself freezing and then moving to a fawn response where I'm begging for mercy and I'm going, oh my God, and I totally break down. That's the PTSD. Okay, what happened to me is awful, but then I'm going to be looking at myself going, oh my God, I'm not safe. So the unconscious very much focuses on safety, and being traumatized is an enduring message from the unconscious. You're not safe, you're not safe. So that's an important element to it.
How do you treat that with your clients, patients?
Clients, patients, the people that I work with, we're trying to bring them back to a place where we can convince the unconscious that they are now safe, and that if that happened again, that they wouldn't respond in the old way. It's not easy. PTSD is tough to work with. CPTSD, complex PTSD, is notoriously very difficult to work with, but it is possible.
What's the difference with how complex is complex PTSD?
Bloody complex. So the analogy that I give, I only fired weapons for the first time in my life about 3 years ago. Went to America, and me and my brother-in-law, we played with a combat shotgun and one of these big 357. Have you fired one of them? Of course.
Fired them all.
Bloody hell! What a bloody noise that thing makes, and it hurts your hand as well. It's not like in the.
Yeah, you're not a small guy.
Yeah. So I noticed. We were given no training. This is in America. They just said, pick your guns. Okay, there you go. They put them in a basket and they just gave them to us. We were shown nothing. When we used it was a Beretta combat shotgun. Lovely, very ergonomic, beautiful design. He fired first, and he fired off 6 rounds in quick succession. And the buckshot spread across so much of the target that in the end it was hanging on by a shred. That's his first time shooting. With this big long 357, it was much more accurate than the Glock that we were using, and we noticed that you could get into their head quite easily, but neither of us had been trained before. We tried it with the Glock and we couldn't do it. And this stuck in my mind. The PTSD moment is the single round. You see it, it's in one spot and it's right there, and you can say it's awful. It's an awful trauma, an awful wound, but you can know where it is. CPTSD is this shredding effect of buckshot. It's multiple tiny little shredding experiences, and I'm sure if there's anybody who's ever done any medical work with gunshot wounds, it's going to be a hell of a lot worse trying to deal with a shotgun blast than a single round, because getting all those bits and pieces out is going to be difficult. So it's CPTSD is multiple fracturing events. PTSD is usually a singular event. CPTSD, you can't remember the key event. PTSD, you do.
Because you've been beaten as a kid, then you had a sexual assault, and then you had you had another accident, and so you add on problem, and you can't find which one is the core one.
There's lots of problems. There's dissociation. There's the fact that you probably were in a state of derealization. You just went into a trance when it happened. That's an issue. But it was Professor Judith Herman, that found this, and she was looking at political prisoners. So if you're imprisoned and you say, or you're a combat veteran and you've been in prison in a foreign country, and you're living with the possibility every day of torture, of execution, just some get out of bed, what are we doing today? We're going to shoot you. That's it. Every day. From the same people who are feeding you, from the same people who offer you shelter, you start to regress into an infantile state. And it's the entrapment and double binding that creates CPTSD. So once I've left the prison, and wherever I was imprisoned, I won't flash back to... there'll be, where the CPTSD, there's always going to be PTSD, so I will flash back to the sound of the prison door opening, yes, and that will give me an emotional response. But sometimes there'll be nothing. There'll be no visual, auditory, or kinesthetic stimulus that goes, oh, it's the sound of the prison door opening. I'm in anxiety. Sometimes you just wake up and go, I'm furious. Nothing. What triggered this? Nothing. What do you remember? Nothing. I'm just furious. It's this unprocessed rage, or unprocessed shame, or unprocessed guilt. Maybe the rest of my team was killed and I survived and I was in prison. Whatever it is. But there's no trigger. There's no memory that we can't go, oh, it was this, and now I'm triggered. You're just nothing, trigger. That's what makes it so hard to treat. Because what they'll do with PTSD is they'll be like, oh, it's this little stirry thing. Let's talk about that. Exposure therapy to the stirry thing. You can't do that with CPTSD. It seems to be context-based. So I come back, we'll continue with this example. I come back, and now it's 10 years later, and I'm an insurance salesman. And my boss tells me off for something that I did. I didn't fill out a form properly in front of people, and it creates a trigger of shame, which then causes a cascade of emotions that regresses me back to being a prisoner. Now I'm ready to kill this guy. I'm ready to literally crush his trachea here and now because he made me feel a little bit embarrassed. And we have examples of guys doing this. There was a TED talk by a Marine who came back, and he never, I don't think anything ever really, he couldn't tell you that anything happened to him, but he lived stayed in Afghanistan for a while, to the point where when he came back to America, when he drove his car, he tells a story, he kept on going to the middle of the road, which is illegal.
And dangerous.
And dangerous, because of this fear imprinted of IEDs. Because everybody he had seen, hurt or damaged or killed, it was an IED. He lives like that for a while, and then he goes to a house party, and somebody pulls a knife in an argument in a house party, and he just lost his shit and beat the hell out of the guy. I don't think he killed him, but he seriously assaulted him and ended up with I think it was an 8 to 12 year prison sentence. Now, without getting into the, it's probably not a very responsible thing to take these kids, turn them into psychopaths, effective psychopaths, and then go, just go and be a clerk in a 7-Eleven. It's trauma. So even in that context, the military training is traumatic. It's deliberately traumatic. It was the British, I think, that
we've all seen Full Metal Jacket.
We've all seen Full Metal Jacket, but I think these were British made. They perfected the psychological trauma to really get people into that state. But Full Metal Jacket, the first half of that, is a brilliant example of it, and that applies to complex PTSD. You're trapped. You're reliant on for food and shelter from your superiors, and though there isn't the threat of death there and then, it's still a very, for a kid, if you're 18 years old, and a lot of young soldiers remember it as being very fun. Yes, fun. You're with your comrades. You're having a good time, but it's still traumatic. It's still frightening. You're still adrenalized. You're still being screamed at by strangers. There's still even just the noise. The noise of the training and everything, it's not natural, and it becomes a kind of traumatically bonding experience. So complex PTSD is multiple wounds, multiple fractures. PTSD is a singular or series of singular. PTSD has a trigger that you can remember visually, auditorily, and kinesthetic. Complex PTSD doesn't. There's no visual, auditory, kinesthetic trigger.
So how do you work with patients too? Because it sounds to me that while in some cases, for example, going through psychotherapy for months or years, trying to remember things could be useful. In some cases, it could bring back extremely traumatic memories with extremely painful and perhaps triggering extremely strong behavior now.
Yes.
So it could be counterproductive.
Absolutely, it and very often is.
In those cases of complex PTSD.
There's not many cases, to be honest with you, where we can say that the traditional model of just talking about your problem over and over again actually offers any insight. It's like this false conclusion they came to, 80 years ago, and it's never worked. There's no data that backs. It's not like, well, we can say that for 40% of clients, they're now fully recovered. They can't show you that. Richard Bandler, one of the founders of NLP, has said, never has anything not worked so badly for so long and still been in business. I mean, it really doesn't work very well. There are good psychotherapists, there are good counsellors, there are good people out there, and people do heal, they do recover, but mainstream just talking, the idea of just talking about something is not great. My background, first I had a psychology degree, then I went and qualified for neuro-linguistic programming, which has a dodgy reputation, quite rightly so, because they do stupid things that they shouldn't do. But the core...
I did that too.
You did it too, NLP. So you'll know, some of the core ideas of NLP, the core principles are great. People are playing videos in their heads. That's what their thoughts are. They're these videos, and they have an element of control to them. And when they play these videos, they go into a series of emotional states. Those emotional states trigger new videos that match the emotional state. So If from that point of view, I sit a client here and I want them to feel better, and I go, let's talk about all the times where you felt like shit. Tell me more, tell me again, let's talk about it again and again. Let's relive it in more and more detail. It gets, they're basically practicing feeling really, really bad.
The exposure therapy, could that also trigger strong reactions and bad feelings, or can it work?
Exposure therapy, by definition, I think has to trigger bad feelings in order for it to be effective. The idea is that you trigger them a small amount over a gradated period of time, and as long as the client is effectively feeling themselves to be in a degree of control, then it will work. But it does have to be very, very carefully handled.
So what is which one you pick when you talk to your patients?
I don't do much by way of exposure therapy. When I'm working with clients, I give them. It's more like I use a strength training model or a skills training model. So if they're weak in something, I try and strengthen them in that. So where I start with the emotions, they're emotionally dysregulated. They're cycling through negative emotions, anxiety, rage, whatever it is. The HPA axis is dysregulated, so they're releasing adrenaline inappropriately, which then affects their cognition, their ability to think. So I reduce that first. So I'll give them skills that help them to reduce the emotional dysregulation, because we can't do anything else until that's covered.
Okay, now fear seems to be at the core of fear and its anxiety declination seems to be at the core of many of the problems that people go through and have to treat. What's your point of view on fear, on treatment of fear, on reduction of fear and anxiety?
I think the thing is to do it intelligently, to have an idea of what it is that is feared, and say, okay, there's going to be a useful element of fear, there's a necessary element to this fear. Where is it? Up to what point do we want you to be fearful? Up to what point do we want you adrenalized? We don't want big dumps of adrenaline in one go. We want slow release adrenaline over time. So we've got to work with fear. We've got to get that adrenaline to work with us so that we're more alert, so that our reactions are faster and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's working with fear intelligently and defining exactly where the line is where we go, okay, this is too much. We don't want you feeling this amount of fear. You want a cold, alert, adrenalized level of awareness that increases performance in relation to a key objective, and not let that tip over. So that's typically how I deal with fear in this situation.
Now, what do you know about survivalism?
I had when I was running the self-defense business, which was called StreetFightSecrets.com, I had a lot of preppers and survivalists following me, a huge number in America, obviously. But me personally, I know very, very little. I was in the cadets when I was a kid, and then I wanted to join the army up until the age of 21, which meant that I went out on camps and exercises with different infantry regiments. I know that I really like the warmth, and I like hot showers and dry beds. That's what I know about survivalism. And if the collapse comes, I'm not that fussed about surviving, to be honest with you. Because there won't be many dry beds and hot showers under those circumstances. But that key subject, very, very little, other than what starts to happen to people psychologically when things start to go very, very wrong very, very quickly. I know a little bit about that.
Now, my concern as a major survivalist author is that the underlying psychological motivation for this movement, and as you will read in the book I gave you the other day, I'm not about living with cold showers all the time and wet beds. Only if you're in good company. But certainly it's about keeping some of the civilization alive, and regardless of what's happening, and therefore it's not about eating wild berries in the forest. It's about really keeping a self-sustainable and healthy lifestyle. However, I sometimes wonder if the psychological underlyings of that movement, or of people in that trip, in that movement, is healthy. It's a question I ask myself. It's a question I wonder sometimes. Most of the people that read my books and that I meet seem to be quite healthy. However, we're all the madman of someone else. So I'm questioning you as a professional. What do you think of that, or could there be some unhealthy motivators behind?
I would ask the same question when I was teaching self-defense and martial arts, which I'm planning on going back to. But when I go back to it next year in 2020, I'm going to be much more explicit about saying that and letting people know that this for me is an interest. I don't get into fights. Nobody wants to fight with me. But the fact that I know how to fight might be helping me to not get into fights. So there is always going to be an element of hobbyism. And so my question would then be like, is it a good hobby or a bad hobby? We are men. We need interests. Is it a healthy interest? And I think in essence it is. I mean, it's if you're a survivalist, what's the weirdest thing that you're going to do? Maybe you're going to get obsessive about particular bits of kit and equipment and weaponry and whatever, and you're going to collect stuff that is just not going to help you because there's just too much of it. But that we're going to do that anyway. I mean, we could be doing motorbikes or whatever, antiques, and we're still going to want that thing because that's what men do. You see it in, I'm into strength training, and in the strength training world, there's this like obsessive, nerdy thing that men get into, and I'd just say, fine, let's just have it. Let's just allow that to be there. When I watched your presentation and reading through your book, I've met people who are oddball preppers, who are, they're praying for the apocalypse. They really want it.
Oh God, let's hope not.
Yeah, and that's where I see in all fields, every field has this element where their lives don't work. They have no place in this society, and they're like, please let it all tear down so that I'm somebody.
Like a reboot. They wish for a reboot.
They wish for a reboot. And that in and of itself, I don't think is not unhealthy. Because sometimes, I watch The Walking Dead, and I think, from a psychological point of view, I wonder if we wouldn't be happier. Intrinsically, like I would wonder if you would.
So you feel alive.
Yeah, you'd.
When you have to survive, you feel alive.
There's a 6-month shock period where you go, wow. I used to say I had social anxiety. I don't seem to have social anxiety anymore. I used to suffer from depression. But when you have to wake up at 4:30 in the morning every day to fix the fence in case the zombies don't break through, suddenly there isn't time for depression. You're in a different biochemical state hormonally. So, yeah, I mean...
And if you do have depression in those conditions, you get in trouble very fast.
You'll die.
Yeah.
You'll die. And... some people watching this, well, in fact, your fans won't find this bothersome, but if I put that on my channel, the sentimentality would kick in. They'd be like, oh, you mustn't let anyone die. Nobody should ever die. And I'm like, are you a child? Everybody dies.
And everybody dies.
Everybody dies. So,
eventually.
And under those circumstances, there is going to be a certain type of person. We're going to see a bell curve of the people who live and the people who die. And that's natural. And maybe that's what will make us feel, perhaps happy isn't the right word, but more in alignment and more congruent and more content. Maybe the fact that we don't feel in alignment and content right now is because we see a lot of unnatural things happening. That evolution's gone one way. I'm not saying it's perfect, I'm not saying it's great or whatever, but if we then go this way, directly opposite to evolution, yeah, there's gonna be a jarring moment where you feel like this doesn't feel good. So I have my suspicion that survival situation, it would be horrifying, it would be awful, it would be a very, very bad 2 or 3 months. And when I say I'm not sure I would want to survive it, I'm only half joking. I mean, it could be very, very bad.
Yeah.
If you then have the aftermath and you're down to 5% of the population, it might not be that bad. Might not be that. You wouldn't want to have an abscess in your tooth or anything, and you wouldn't want to get injured because it's going to really suck. But for generally, psychologically, I think people would feel better.
Now, most of your viewers are women, whereas most of my viewers are men. My channel has 80%, and my readers are 80% male. Now, I wrote a book, this one, and I'm going to give it to you. Woman, On the Verge of Societal Breakdown. That's the English version.
Thank you.
Now,
Merci.
I wrote this book especially for women who, and to explain why women seem to not be interested about survival, and I think it's a big mistake for them to not be interested, in the sense that they have more to lose, they have more to fear, in fact, from the potential collapse of what we consider normal, which today is a big civilization, complex civilization. Why would you think, like instinctively, why would you think women are less concerned about society collapsing, whereas if it does collapse, all the rights they've gained over the last 100 years, all the advantages they hold now, all the security especially that they hold now, could possibly completely disappear, and then they're in a world of pain, even more than men, potentially.
Tu m'as invité de danser dans un grand fucking minefield. So I will danser là without blowing my fucking legs off. I don't have any proper research to back this up. I can only talk anecdotally. When I was teaching self-protection, based on the statistics, at one point I was living in London teaching self-protection. Women are far more likely to be attacked
of course,
than men. And when they are attacked, it is worse, far worse. I might get a bloody nose and a cracked rib. Much. There was a problem at one time when I was living in London with girls walking home from work at 8, 9 o'clock at night through rough areas with the headphones in and on their phones. And so, myself and other instructors were trying to say to them, look, you can't do that. It's not safe. And the response, 98% of the time was, it's my right. It's my right. It should be safe. And you go, but it isn't. And so,
but isn't the right of the gazelle to graze the savannah in front of the lion?
It is. So there is. How should I say? How should I put it?
A disconnect?
Well, there's a difference in male and female psychology. A very big difference in male and female psychology.
Which is, by the way, great.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
We love that.
It's beautiful.
I love that.
Yeah. And if you do meet, as I think
I'm just trying to get some minds away from the minefield.
Yeah, from the minefield. Well, very clever. Well done. But we've both met very masculine-minded women, and it's a strange feeling. It's not necessarily something that's particularly charming, but for all feminism claims to have done, and for all of this culture of sex in the city style, Beyonce style, it's very cheap statement of being a strong, independent woman, there is still a massive blind spot on the reliance, let me not say on a reliance of men, let me say on a reliance of systems created and run by men.
Protecting them, for
yes,
sure.
And there's a total blind spot to that. And
which we're very happy to build, by the way.
Absolutely. Men are happy to build it. As men make sacrifices for women, and they're happy because there's a reciprocation. Women make sacrifices for men, and they're happy because there's a reciprocation. And that, despite all of the problems we're having between the sexes right now, that still exists. It still exists.
But probably on a lower level than it has ever existed.
Yes.
That's important to remind, right?
Absolutely. We're tilting. We've not collapsed, but we're tilting. We're tilting towards a bad way. And it's always good to remember that the worst examples of this are a minority, but they're a very vocal minority. So they make you think that the situation is worse than it is. But it has tilted. So there is, and I've worked, as you rightly say, it's 90% women that I work with, and it's been since 2012, which is 7 years now. There is a tendency, it seems to me, for women to, I wouldn't even say abrogate responsibility, but to kind of go, to just throw it at the hands. When it came to self-protection, it was like, well, if it happens, I'll just kick him in the balls, which is a childish answer, which they kind of knew. They'd say it with a smirk, so they know that that's not really going to happen. And it kind of reflected this strange sort of solipsistic, I don't really think it's going to happen to me, and if it does, there's nothing I can do anyway, so I'm not going to learn. And that was with a lot of women that I spoke to. Similarly with the survivalist thing, I think you get the same thing. Like, they don't really think that they're going to survive anyway. Like, if you're not going to survive, I'm not going to survive. It seems to be the mindset. But yeah, absolutely, every human should be concerned with that. Everybody should be concerned with that. But you particularly asked me about women, so I do wonder if there is a blind spot that many, not all, but many women have about those elements of life that are offered, that are key leverage points around which their world spins, that are created by and maintained by men. I was engaging with a woman recently. She's a coach. I'll put the interview up on my channel, and she was talking about being a strong, independent woman, how women can do everything men can do, and I kept on bringing it back to the front lines. I said, well, what about the front lines? And she said, well, why do you keep talking about war? And I was like, well, the world we have, the boundaries around our countries are drawn by people historically who came together on a battlefield in some format and stabbed and shot each other to death. That is not a place where women, you can't say women can do that.
Yeah, I've heard that wars did happen in the past. It could happen in the future.
Maybe.
I mean, maybe in history something has happened that
Yes.
included violence.
Yes,
I mean, it's a rumor.
It's a rumor that we've heard, and so.
Yeah.
But she didn't want to talk about that, and I understand, because it wasn't a conversation predominantly about war. But what I was trying to do was say, look, there are certain elements of life that are going to be the sole dominion of men, no matter what. And there are certain elements of life that are going to be the sole dominion of women. What is the core thing that all men can do, and the core thing that all women can do, that neither can do as well as the other? Women can make life. Men can take life. What are the two oldest professions? Prostitution, assassin, or soldier. Giving life, taking life. And they're the primal dominions. That's why women, historically, have always had a privileged place in any culture.
Of course.
Look at Spartan culture.
Well, I know some cultures where they don't.
Of course. So there are. So historically,
And it's not ours, by the way. It's not the Western.
ours,
It's not the
ours.
West.
But generally,
The West is not a patriarchy.
no,
At least not anymore, for sure.
no,
For a long time.
Yeah, I mean, if you start, we could talk about Saudi Arabia or even Iran. You know, it's yeah.
The list is long.
Yeah, the list is long. But historically, generally, there has been a somewhat privileged position. You look at like Greek culture, the Spartans.
In the West is very privileged.
Very, very
Women were
privileged.
very important.
And there's a realization and recognition that this side of the spectrum, of the yin-yang spectrum, is life. Our great skill is not, we're expendable to that extent, which is why I think historically most men never procreated. And I think it's only 40% of all men who've ever lived actually procreated, or some statistic along those lines. So to me it feels very infantile to say, well, women can do everything men can do. Well, show me the guy who's saying a man can do everything a woman can do. I can't. There are things women can do that I wouldn't even attempt, because I know I'm not going to be at the level that a woman can naturally do it. This is the minefield, and now I'm trapped in it.
No, I think that's very reasonable. I'd be happy to have your opinion, and I'd be happy to hear your audience's opinion on this book, because I think it's quite balanced in terms of why men and women should collaborate and work together in a way, in a symbiosis and in cooperative and complementary way.
You're saying that men and women should work together in a symbiosis in a way that's cooperative and that's indicated by our biology. Yes, the clues that we should be together are indicated.
Well, in fact, yeah.
God has left us some clues.
But actually, what's interesting is I've interviewed even there's some women homosexual couples that there's something like 20 or 25 interviews of women who are actually doing preparation and actually thinking about these things. And I think one or two of those are lesbian couples, and they have an interesting perspective as well on. They're not these militant, rabid, anti-man persons. They are very conscious that, there are roles that, in society that men are fundamental, and feminism, at least the recent forms of it, is destroying that. Whereas at the beginning, at least, they wanted some sort of equality in terms of rights, and which is understandable. But now it's we want you to be our slaves and do whatever we want, which is nonsense, because we will never accept that. I mean, some of us might, because they think they get laid with through that, but it's not going to work.
There's no longevity in this ideology that we have now that claims to be feminism. I mean, I studied feminism in university. It's not. You got people who go, "I'm a feminist." You go, well, "Which books did you read? Where did you study?" No, I'm just a feminist. Oh, okay. Well, then anybody can just claim that they're a fucking psychologist or a sociologist on the basis of what?
Well, people don't know if they're. People could claim to be man, woman, whatever, depending of the weather of the day. So today, and a lot of these things make no sense.
Yeah.
Richard, I thank you for your time. Is there any message you'd like to leave for our survivalist viewers, especially French-speaking ones that could understand English, by the way?
That could understand English. It's good to be focused on survival, and make sure you're not just focusing on surviving, but on thriving. You know, don't just think about the chaos and the pain and the bad things that could happen. Build the best life that you could possibly build. I think survivalism lends itself to that, to being in nature, to being self-sufficient, you know, organic food and all the rest of it. Focus on thriving, focus on living a really, really good life, as well as surviving the apocalypse. I
forgot a question. The other day we happened to meet a survivalist friend of mine who has a farm. So you've been, a small farm, very small, and you've been to on his place. We just went to say hi. And what was your impression of his setup? Which is very similar to mine, by the way.
I just thought he lives in a beautiful house that's away from, you know, traffic and too many people, up the side of a hill in a forest, and it's beautiful. Just a really, really nice way to live. It would be, if you hadn't said he was a survivalist, I would have just said this is a nice place.
Yeah. He makes his own beer.
Yeah.
He has his vegetable garden, his ducks and chickens and pigs and dogs, I think, and. Other animals did we see?
I saw the ducks. He has two very nice dogs as well.
They were cute. Yeah. And it seems a balanced life. He had a baby now, and
it's a very, very nice,
happy life.
Yeah.
So this is what I try to get the people to do. I'm not saying that you have to live off your land, but you should, you know, get a more balanced and healthy life, and it's not about being paranoid and living in the woods and fearing the zombie apocalypse every day. Although,
I was criticised recently for saying this on a video, that basically the revolution that we need at the moment really isn't one about trying to inflict an ideology on a group. It's actually, the revolution will come when we all decide to overcome our own agitation and aggression and everything else and be happy. If everybody's happy, it's going to be very hard to control this if we're all content. If we're all feeling good, if we're all living good lives, it's going to be very hard to control this.
Being happy is not what the system ever wanted. You always want needs so that you can bring solutions.
Oui, c'est vrai. I wanted to put some French in there.
Richard, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
We'll meet again. Take care.
Thank you, sir.